I'm just like weeping at the end. And I'm like looking at my partner, like, is this the point of the movie? Why do people want to watch this? And she's like, yeah, so people want to watch movies that make you sad. And I'm like, I don't want to watch movies that make me sad.
Welcome to Cult Favorite, the podcast that's going to spend roughly an hour on roughly one day. I'm Marin Simmons.
And I'm Mike Altman. And we are going to continue to talk about these cult documentaries. You can't stop binge watching. This week, we have a relatively new one that just came out from National Geographic on Hulu. It is called Cult Massacre, One Day in Jonestown. But before we dig into that, real quick, if you want to support our show and help more people find us, you can follow us on Instagram. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on TikTok, and you can sort of repost all of our stuff there. But the biggest thing you can do is follow us on whatever podcasting app you're using and leave us a rating and a review. And also, you can steal people's phones and make them follow us so it'll just download. It'll be fine. They won't even know.
And it's Jonestown Day, everybody. So that means that we're going to be talking about suicide and murder, and the classification thereof. So be mindful and aware of that before we get going. What did we know about Jonestown?
What did you know about Jonestown before this 3-part documentary?
So, I mean, I think I knew what most people know. I have the general stereotypes or nutshells. We talked about like how Heaven's Gate was called the cult of cults, but Jonestown is sort of the place that gave us cult as a category. It's definitely like after Jonestown is when we start having like cult watching as a phenomenon, people paying attention to these social and religious groups and trying to make sense of them. This was also like, I didn't know this, but so yeah, what I knew before was like the stuff about Kool-Aid and when, the colloquial expression of like people drinking the Kool-Aid I knew came from Jonestown, but I didn't know, and I found out through looking at stuff for this documentary that it was the biggest loss of U.S. civilian life outside of like stuff like pandemics and wars and things until 9/11. I didn't know that. Yeah, I mean it makes sense, I guess. It was over 900 people, but anyway, that's what I knew. I knew the basic nutshell stereotype stuff. Yeah,
what I knew about it came from Jonathan Z. Smith. Historian of religion, in his book Imagining Religion from like 1982 has a chapter, The Devil in Mr. Jones. And so I read that.
So this is like only a few years after it happened.
He's writing it pretty close to after it happened. And that.
Is this something you had to like read in school?
Yeah, I think I read it in grad school.
Okay.
My first year of grad school. And so in the context of the whole book, but the essay is, It gives an overview and a very quick overview and history of Jim Jones and how he gets there. And like the point of the essay is he's writing in 1982 or it's published in 1982. He's basically saying I've been looking all over since this event happened, and no religious studies people are talking about this at all. We don't seem to want to talk about it or know what to do with it, and the media reports, he actually uses the phrase, the sort of the pornography of the violence in the media is such that we somehow think that Jones and the whole event is sort of like unintelligible, this sort of unintelligible evil, and that he sort of says our job as people who study religion for a living is to make that intelligible. And so the whole point is sort of making this strange thing somehow familiar, either by comparing it to something else we recognize, but to not let it stand as like impossible to understand.
A precursor to Musey's work on Heaven's Gate.
Yeah, exactly. So that was all I kind of knew. I hadn't watched. I know there's this is one of many documentaries on Jonestown. We'll probably circle back to some others eventually. So I had not seen any of those. And so this was my first encounter. And I would not recommend this as a first documentary on Jonestown.
Interesting. It's you and I have different feelings about this documentary, which is going to be fun to talk about.
Yeah, no, and I think, I don't know that this one. If you don't,
why not?
Well, I don't know if you don't know the full story. It is almost I almost called like a micro documentary. It's so focused. It literally is focused on like one day in Jonestown. Yeah. So if you don't know, it doesn't give you a lot of the bigger context.
The framing.
I mean, I remember when I was watching it, it was we go from the introduction of Jones to Leo Ryan jumping on the airplane and heading to Guyana in like
Congressman,
15 minutes.
Yeah.
So So if you haven't, we should spoil this real fast. If you haven't seen it yet, here's a quick 5-minute rundown of. It really is just one night in Jonestown. There's no talking heads. There's no real analysis. There's no explanation. There's the reporters that are in it are the reporters who were on this trip. So it's very much sort of like firsthand stories from either the government officials who went down, the media or who went down, or the survivors who were there and left or whatever.
Is it useful to say 10 seconds worth of like what Jonestown is?
Yeah.
And what?
So yeah, and 10
like before the documentary synopsis?
Yeah. So yeah.
You want me to do that?
Sure.
Jim Jones was he founded the People's Temple, which was a church out in San Francisco in the early 70s. He was from Indiana. He had done some stuff in like the 50s and 60s, but he was a political progressive. He started the People's Temple to try to facilitate racial justice, economic justice, was doing a lot of social activism in the community, and then got increasingly paranoid about like what was going on in the U.S. The temple goes down to Guyana in South America. They create what initially is called like the People's Temple Agricultural Project. And so they start farming and they build this sustainable community, and they're there for like a couple of years. And then in 1978, there are like 1,000 people living there, and over 900 of them drink some flavor aid substance that we, kind of have popularly branded as Kool-Aid with cyanide in it, and over 900 people died. And so that's the kind of Jonestown arc.
So, okay, with that laid out, what do you want to talk about, Miranda?
Ooh, do I go first?
You can go first.
Okay. So, I have a couple of things I want to talk about, but first I mentioned that you and I have kind of different senses of whether this documentary was effective or good. We heard, I think that there was like a little implicit in your voice as you were spelling out how this documentary rundown summary was going, that like you weren't really into it. So why don't you think it worked? And then I will highlight a couple of things that I want to talk about because I think it worked.
I think it worked. I know. It's not that I don't think it worked. It's that I don't like what it did. It was a My Girl experience. Like I had to watch My Girl for the first time recently. It's a long story, but like I'm just like weeping at the end. And I'm like looking at my partner, like, is this the point of the movie? Why do people want to watch this? And she's like, yeah, so people want to watch movies that make you sad. And I'm like, I don't want to watch movies that make me sad. And so like, that was sort of my take was like.
You felt emotionally manipulated.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
I have a theory as to why.
Go ahead.
Here's my hot take.
Okay.
Here's my hot take. I think that in our current, because this is a very recent documentary. It's made in the last year or so. Just came out a month ago.
Which is an important thing to take stock of, in as much as this was something that happened in 1978,
Right.
and there have been lots of
Right.
documentaries
Yes,
and
books
stuff written about
and-
Jonestown.
yes.
So why do we need another one in
Yes.
this moment?
From 1982 when J.Z. Smith was like, no one's written about this, to
Right.
now there's been a ton. But I think that in our current like post-Trump but still MAGA moment, in a post-QAnon, post-January 6th moment, people know a lot of people in their families who've done weird shit, and they don't know why.
Like in the name of a kind of strongman
in the name of a
figure?
strongman figure.
Okay.
And so I think there's something about this documentary where it makes Jonestown relatable and emotionally by tapping into that same feeling of like, I have no idea why my uncle has joined QAnon. I have no idea why, any of these things, right? I don't have no idea why my aunt was at January 6th, but
The kids are not okay. Kind
right.
Of thing.
But oh wow, all sorts of people get caught up in these things. And it doesn't give you an explanation. It's actually just sort of like, it's reflecting that befuddlement and that experience back to you. Like in some ways, we're all Stephen Jones, his son, who's interviewed in the documentary, and is sort of just like, he was fucking nuts. Like he says at one point, and I hated him. And like, I think that in a kind of like that in that current moment, lots of people know people they are deeply alienated from and don't understand why.
Okay, so this is so interesting, and so I'm excited to get into it because that is exactly the reason that I kind of I won't say enjoyed, but why I find the documentary compelling. And I was actually going into it with a fair degree of skepticism because it's like I don't know, maybe it was a prejudgment of National Geographic because so much of National Geographic in my head, at least, is a descriptive account of the exotic or whatever.
Which is what this is.
But here's, I guess, the thing that I found really, but it doesn't give descriptive account, is what you're saying, that right? Like, because it doesn't give a lot of framing, it doesn't make meaning of it,
No.
And all it does is it leaves us with the reality of the discomfort and the befuddlement. And I really appreciate the leaving us to squirm in the discomfort of a thing without trying to put a tidy narrative package around it that says this is why X, Y, and Z. Really, the only kind of analytical account of it, like the only analysis we get is from his son, who's able to provide, for better or worse, some kind of like psychoanalytic description of what he thinks his ego was up to, what his dad's ego was up to. But other than that, we're just hearing people talk about this moment in their lives. And I think it forces us to confront in a messier way the stuff that I think so often around something called cults, the temptation is to because cults are, just something that gets labeled as weird and messed up.
Right.
We have a tendency to want to put some sort of narrative packaging around it to make it make sense so that we can keep ourselves at a safe distance. Like that's what weirdos who get manipulated, that's what they get for being hippies. That's what, and I would never do that because like my psyche is totally intact and I would never be subject to the manipulation of anything at all.
Right.
Like, I think that that's how we tend to narrativize these groups. And so I kind of appreciated the lack of narrative framing, first of all. And maybe it's because too, like, all of my degrees are in English. And so I appreciate a close read.
Right.
And like the zooming in on one small thing in order to talk about a bigger thing. And so maybe just the focus on one day was kind of like a cinematic equivalent of a close read. I don't know.
Right.
But that's interesting.
Yeah. And I think there's a, Marian Muhammad, the director of the series, did an interview with TV Insider that was, I think, interesting because she says at one point, we'll put a link in the show notes, but she says at one point that like we were living in an era of cult documentaries. And then she also says, I think we live in a time where there is an obsession with strongman leaders and charismatic leaders. I think as humans and as a society, we'll always be attracted to that. Mm-hmm. And so there's this, I do think that there's something about our current, I don't think it's all Trump per se, but I think there's something about our current political social moment that these documentaries are trying to tap into.
Yeah.
Some do it more effectively than others. What is missed by the reliance upon these sort of like first person narratives mostly by people who were dropped in. Like a lot of it is the media and Jackie Spears and there's a few survivor accounts, but they're always telling stories about like that day. Mm-hmm. I have a vague sense of why someone, at one point Tim Carter says like, I believed in what we were building here, but I still don't know why someone would be at that church in San Francisco, how they would be convinced to go to Guyana. Like there's a lot of questions about like, how did these people get here and who are they?
If you were just watching this outside of all of the other stuff. Yeah. I guess maybe because there is so much that has been written and said and done with Jonestown, maybe that's why she thought that would be okay. I'm not sure.
No, I think you're right. I think this sort of depends on this.
A little bit of foreknowledge.
Right. And I think that like we saw with the Heaven's Gate, the director there talked about the genre of the cult documentary. I feel like this is another one. It's being the newest that sort of relies upon an audience that is already watching these and is going to watch this one next and has probably watched, the Women of Jonestown one, which is another kind of like micro one we'll have to get to at some point, has probably seen the other, the PBS Jonestown doc. And so it's like you kind of already, like here's a new take. Here's a bunch of footage you haven't seen. A lot of the news footage they dug up. And so like there's an audience for this already, the same audience that should be listen to this podcast. And so we don't have to worry about,
so much framing.
I
wonder if, this may be because of what you're saying about our current political and just civic social moment, but I kind of, another thing that I appreciated about the approach was that there wasn't such a reliance on here is Jim Jones, the caricature of pure evil. And maybe because the focus on the individual as such is something that, as we have talked about at length, is a thing that drives me kind of nuts. Because as soon as it's about that person as this person, then I think it's easier for us to create a story monster that is external to ourselves, that is something that easily explains these horrific traumas on a kind of broad scale, rather than thinking about what kinds of things create those personal and social dynamics in the first place. So for me, like, I think that there was a value or a effectiveness of those first person accounts sans analysis. Like the fact that there were no talking heads and no scholars. Right. On one hand, I do think that like we are probably never like reliable narrators of our own experience, right? We are not certainly there's no like objective way to talk about what happens to us. So I am skeptical of just like experiential authority as a kind of starting and stopping point. But because there's always, always, always filter for the things that we think or say or feel, and because we're always telling stories and making meaning retroactively to make sense of stuff that happens, especially when it's traumatic, I think that fact, that phenomenon is like more overt or self-aware or something in these first-person accounts. Because when you have people offering third-person analyses, like we saw in the Heaven's Gate documentary, those, I think, run the risk and frequently fall into the temptation of thinking that like personal remove from the specific situation is also remove of those filters and the baggage that we bring to the table when we're talking about something.
Yeah, I think that makes a total sense, because you actually kind of had like two competing explanations in Heaven's Gate, whereas here you don't really have any competing explanations. You just have like almost a plea of like, stop saying drink the Kool-Aid and recognize this was murder. Like, that's what we want. And then like, here's your evidence as to why that's an ethical thing to do.
Here's my tangent for the day. And I don't know if we've talked about this before, so you can cut this out or not as you see fit. But have you seen this is my 90s reference for the day too. Have you seen the Ethan Hawke Hamlet?
No.
Okay. So I do not know if this movie stands up. I have not watched it in, I guess, some decades now. But being the good, like, child of the 90s that I was, teenager of the 90s that I was, there was the Ethan Hawke did a remake of Hamlet. Yeah. And it was like cast. It was one of those modern day things. This is also in like the DiCaprio Romeo and Juliet that he did with Claire Danes. DiCaprio Danes Romeo and Juliet came out. And so it's a modern staging of Hamlet that's happening in this like media corporate setting. And what I remember from it, and so again, if I watched it again, would I share my own opinion? I don't know. But what I do recall was that, and this was a play that I had read for like in a lot of settings over the course of a lot of years because English degrees. And I remember that Ophelia, who always gets cast as and gets performed as just, she goes nuts. She goes crazy. Right. And then she starts talking about stuff that doesn't make sense. And she's babbling about flowers and whatever. In the movie, like, I mean, she has lost her father and brother. She is like losing the person she loves. Things are happening that are like, her life is turning inside out. And instead of playing that moment as, and so my mind broke, she's just so angry.
Interesting.
And so sad. And she like is standing up at the top of these stairs and she just screams. And I found it so compelling because like, yeah, if you're in the position that Ophelia's in, you're going to be so sad and angry. And whether that kind of mental break looks like this or that or the other, like it isn't, it just felt so much more empathetic. It just felt so much more humane to like a person in that situation. And I feel like there was a similar way that these kinds of positionings were happening. Right. Like, here's a person who's talking about their experience, and I don't know if they were brainwashed or manipulated or whatever, but they're real sad.
Yeah.
Because they lose like 11 members of their family in one person's case that we hear from, or the wife and child of the other member that we hear from. Like, and I don't know, there was just something really humane about that.
There is something about in not offering an explanation, you don't offer bad explanations. Mm-hmm. So the brainwashing idea which I think is a big piece of the suicide language that they're trying to get like rid of, is, is not there. And you see not like coercion in some sort of ambiguous way, but in like a large number of these people have been stabbed in the neck with syringes. And so, yeah, I think part of my thing is like, it's a personality quirk that I turned into a professional strength of. I feel like if I just have enough information, I can figure out the pattern to explain the thing. And so the whole time I'm watching this, I'm like, what did it say on that note that they hand out here? 'Cause we never hear the whole thing. I'm like, okay, so there's guards. Who are those guards? How close to Jones are they? How loyal to Jones are they? Who are they? How did you become a guard? Yeah. And I'm like, if I knew all this stuff, this is like my Always Sunny in Philadelphia, string and paper FBI board moment of like, if you give me all this stuff, I think that's what bugged me.
I get it. I mean, I totally get it. I just also, the thing that's making you squirm, I mean, it makes me squirm too. I guess maybe I'm in a place where I have, and maybe because of the moment that we're in, I don't know, but I am appreciating, I'm appreciating an approach to disaster, trauma, confusion, devastation, that lets it be what it is, because it's not going to make it less devastating if I know why it's happening. Do you know what I mean?
No, I do.
I read an interesting interview in the New York Times recently with a climate scientist who's, young. I think she's in her 40s. And the person who, I mean, young to me. Okay. Yeah, I hear you laughing. I see you laughing. So
I just turned 40. I'm still young.
The interviewer is doing the thing that makes sense of interviewers, where he's like, well, I know better than to do this or that in my life that is killing the environment, but I still don't do it, and why don't I do that? And she's like, I don't know, why don't you? Like, she doesn't let him off the hook with it, but she's also not being preachy about it. Because then he goes on to like ask for some like, make meaning of this. Like the planet is on fire and nothing seems like it's going to be okay. And so tell us, scientist who knows better, why and how it's actually going to be okay. And she's like, I mean, it's not an audio interview that I hear, but like the way that I was reading it and her quotes, it was just like, I mean, it's not going to be okay though, man. Like, I know exactly what's going to happen because I'm a climate scientist. And so I do have the data, and it's not going to be okay, period. Then like, because it's not going to be okay, here's how maybe we should thinking about community. And because it's not ever going to be all right, and because we have already let the horse out of the barn, where our behaviors and our use of resources are concerned, then, I mean, if you're a gazillionaire, you could buy an island and build a bunker. But I don't know that I want to live like that. And so since the world is on fire, not if eventually, like since it's on fire, then maybe we could think a little bit more substantively and with more nuance about the communities that we're creating locally and the way that we engage with those.
Okay, two things. Two things. One,
I'm here to tell you that nothing's going to be okay again, Mike.
Well, no, you're making me realize how often one can chase down all of the explanations, lay it all out there, have here's why this happened, or here's how this happens, or whatever, and still be incredibly angry after all of that. Yeah. Right? And it doesn't actually help. So which is why I don't like my
well,
girl.
like it helps intellectually, right? Like take nothing
Right.
away from
But
that.
but that anger at the end is still there regardless, right? And so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is what you just said about if the world is on fire, we should think about the kind of communities we're building. Like that was the Jonestown pitch. We're in, his first earliest prediction was about nuclear destruction, and which he predicted but was missed. But like when he's, the pitch of sort of like, this is all broken, we have to come up with a new way to do community. Like that was the Jonestown pitch. And I'm not unsympathetic to the original pitch, right?
It was a good pitch. I mean, like before they went to Guyana, like he was, and I'm not, suggest like the politics that he was engaged in were at least civically and socially for real. I'm not saying sincere. Like I don't have anything to say about sincerity or intentionality, but like
they were effective.
He was working for like, affordable housing, and if like, and would like do things toward racial justice that other people weren't doing. Like he was legit organizing socially. And it's why we hear from so many, I think it's part of why it was able to get so big. One of the reasons, right? But then it's also why we hear from the people who were members, like, yeah, we were building a utopia. We were doing, and this was at a time that lots of people were doing that. Like,
yeah,
one of the former members talks about this at the very beginning, where she explains, like, this is a time of social upheaval, and and we were looking for ways to reimagine what society could be. And so you have different groups doing that. And she cites, the Black Panthers. She cites Hare Krishnas. But the People's Temple was another one of those groups. And yeah.
And I think it'll be interesting in a few episodes down the line to come back and watch some of the more expansive documentaries, because there's a lot, and I don't want to spoil a lot of stuff yet, but there's like a lot of stuff about, Jones's kind of his Pentecostalism, his influence from folks like Father Divine, and all this other stuff that we could get into.
Sounds like a bonus episode.
Ooh. So what?
Okay, wait. So I'm still on this because I think that because I hear you and I understand what you mean about like these horrific experiences and situations can often be cloaked in and are, frequently cloaked in the narratives of like what's going to be awesome about it. And here's what's going to be good. And the community as a thing that draws people in, only then to be bamboozled in these like really tragic ways. And I get that. I just think that it is so much more, it's just so much easier to remove our own complicity in the complicity in creating situations where people really need things so desperately, socially and structurally, that when someone comes along and says, I will offer you, not just a path to salvation. Like, I feel like that was kind of secondary. And I don't know enough about the ins and outs to really comment on that. But what he was offering was free housing and free healthcare and food. And like sustainable community organizing in a way that, like, I'm kind of giving a spoiler for my own takeaway, that if people had those social supports, it wouldn't be as compelling in the first place. And So this is my second tangent, but it's not from the 90s. This is actually like contemporaneous with Jonestown, and the People's Temple anyway. I really love horror movies. I think partly because those also are a genre that can alleviate anxiety.
I do not.
Oh my God, I love them so much.
I don't like sad movies or horror movies.
Okay, but here's why. Is because, I mean, I feel like, horror can go in 13 directions, but like one of two ways. Like either it's something that exacerbates anxiety or it's something that alleviates anxiety. For me, it is definitely, I'm very much in the latter camp because the world is on fire and nothing's going to be okay. But do you know what I don't have to worry about? Like a demon shark that is...
I spent too many years worried about demon sharks.
Oh my God, no. No, it's like if I can externalize the monster, then that makes me feel better because I have a sense of my own security. I can look at Jigsaw doing something horrible in the Saw franchise in a warehouse in the middle. Like that is a whole other complicated universe outside of my experience where there are 20 billion things to stress me out, but not Jigsaw. I feel like externalizing the monster makes us feel better is what I'm getting to. So one of my very favorite horror movies is Black Christmas from 1974. This will be somehow the weird connection that I make. Olivia Hussey is in it, among other people who are amazing. But Olivia Hussey was in the Romeo and Juliet from that time period. Anyway, that's my Romeo and Juliet callback. Black Christmas, in a nutshell, like there are sorority girls living in a house, and some of them are left there over the holidays, and there's someone terrorizing them over the phone. But at the very end, and we think that we've caught the person and everything is like, da-da, we've identified the monster. He's out there. We have like caught him. The police have saved the day and now everyone's fine. But the call is like coming from inside the house. Like that's what we come to understand. And it's what makes it so terrifying. And I think that when we create monsters out of people and caricatures, it's so much more comforting than to admit the susceptibility and vulnerability of our own psyches, because we never want to think that the call is coming from inside the house. We always want to think that it's out there. And if we can identify Jim Jones as this kind of monster out there.
But okay.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with that. But isn't that what the documentary does, though? Because Jones is rendered as this inhuman, addiction-addled... Mm-hmm. Like, one guy calls him a crazy son of a bitch.
Okay.
His son calls him nuts as they come.
Right. Okay, so let me be clear. I'm not actually saying anything about... The thing about Jim Jones with this documentary is that they take the focus... And I don't know that you agree with this, because we were talking before we started recording, and I don't know that this is where you stand on this, but I felt like the documentary kind of decentered him from the. I mean, obviously he's the center of the story, in as much as they called this agricultural project in Guyana Jonestown, right? Like he made himself this crucial center. He was the sun around which all of these followers orbited, structurally, so that, like, again, Congressman Ryan could have gotten on the plane with a dozen followers, gone home, and it would have been fine. I mean, not fine, obviously, fine. But but as far as Jim Jones was concerned, except it wasn't fine because, at least, like if we're listening to the story that his son tells, any defection is a personal betrayal. And he was so like hopped up on amphetamines, like living in this place that he has created, who knows what kind of things are happening inside or outside of his brain. But what we do know is that it was a kind of like, any person leaving was also a direct betrayal of him. And as he begins to, if people are leaving, then he is getting fractured.
Yeah.
And that cannot stand. And so what I understood the documentary to be doing, though, or what I was left with as like the monsters that we're creating, Jim Jones for sure, but also the way that I saw that happening was when the media, when the survivors start coming back, when the media gets hold of the story, and when we see the journalists start, you mentioned this earlier, so this is like one of those examples. The journalists start talking to the people who survived, or the people who were in the capital city, Georgetown, who were still members of People's Temple, but weren't like there in Jonestown on that day. And the questions that they ask and the way that they talk to these people are completely whack. Like,
yes, whack.
Because
I don't mean to laugh. Whack,
because they are making of these people caricatures and monsters of like, so one of the interviews that we hear, and then we hear from her later, like in present day, is from Leslie Wagner Wilson. She is holding, in this interview right after this happened, she's holding her son Jakari. She had been a member since she was 13. It's all she knew. She's this 21-year-old mom. She decides with a few other people to like leave and escape that morning, and is like, I was convinced we were going to get caught, but it just so happened.
They used the congressman as a decoy and like sneak off while he's talking.
Yeah. And so he provides a distraction. And I don't know if that was like intention, like, was it planned that way? Or was it like they were getting out and it just so happened that coincided on a day when there was a distraction? I don't know. But what we do see is a journalist talking to her and saying that if you had not left, if you had been there that day, would you have given poison to your child? She says, no. Like, no. He goes on. You mean to tell me, with all these other people, with all your friends, with all of this happening, would you have done this? And she's like, no, I wouldn't have. And then he's like, you would have. Like, then he starts talking in declaratives. He's not even asking questions anymore. You would have probably taken it too. You probably would have given it to Jakari. And she's just sitting there, just like shaking her head. And it's whether or not, like that very question that then turns into a declarative, I feel like is about that journalists need to make sense of something that he can't make sense of. Yeah. It's too big. It's too much. It's too sad. It's too tragic. And so you would have, it's because that you're a murderer, right? I need to believe that.
Right.
Because otherwise, what kind of world do I live in?
Right.
And she's like, no, man, I can't do that for you. I can't.
Yeah. No, and the
yeah.
phrases, I was like going through and writing these down. Like, I think it's Tom Brokaw. Somebody calls it an orgy of suicide and murder, like on the Today Show. And then there's another one about they call the Jonestown suicide camp. Like, there is, that's an interesting point. That the monster isn't just Jones, that the monster is this
10,000%. That's why the whole, like, none of the airlines were going to take them back and made them have air marshals, because they just didn't want like the cult stink to get on them. Like, it was unreal. Another journalist says to one of the people, like, did you think about going back because you could have saved people?
Oh my God. Why didn't you go back?
And so, like, yeah, I think that it's So what I guess I'm trying to get at is that it is like as we confront these horrific experiences or these situations, and as we confront things that don't make sense to us, back to the J.Z. Smith essay, like it is easier to say nothing at all, to his point, like it's been 3 years, everybody, like where is the conversation about this?
Right.
And another approach to it is to say, well, I can only make sense of this, I can only talk about it if I continue to feel my own safe distance from something like that.
Yeah.
And the way that I feel my safe distance is if I create a demon shark out of these people.
There's a moment where I think this is like very starkly illustrated when the military official is talking to the press about, we're trying to identify all these people. So if anyone has dental records or photographs, please send them to our mortuary office here. And a phone's ringing in the background. Like this, I was like gobsmacked by this.
Yeah.
So this phone starts ringing in the background of the room. And he says, can we get this phone cut? Can we turn that phone off? Get the phone off. Put it in a half glass of Kool-Aid. And then gives this smile. And everyone's like, oh my, like.
So what it is that, and we talked about this just in conversation outside of the recording for Heaven's Gate. But like the thing that allows Heaven's Gate to become fodder for a cold open in Saturday Night Live, like how many days later?
Right.
Like the thing that allows this to become a joke for someone in a press conference who's like asking about like documenting, identifying people and sending information so that they can like figure out who's who, is what I find so I don't know, like worth paying attention to at the very least. That like we are only able to make that kind of joke or that kind of comedy sketch about something if we have like enough distance. Like if we can only do that if we have so many degrees of remove personally.
Yeah.
And it's that refusal to admit our own proximity to vulnerability, to structural lack, to the need for social services.
Well, and it's the transition of Jones, leader of this Christian socialist church, Jones, leader of this majority African-American socialist church, critic of capitalism and all these other things. And Smith actually says, most religious studies people were very relieved to find out that Jones was a Marxist because it meant they didn't have to talk about religion anymore, right? Like it was and to Jones as leader of suicide cult, right? So there's this slippage from any criticism of capitalism to suicide immediately, and in both cases, these are things that allow one to sort of hold these things at arm's length, especially if you're a military official or a member of the media.
But the call's coming from inside the house,
okay,
y'all.
So yeah, what's our takeaway?
Okay, well,
we may have already given our takeaways.
Well, you give your takeaway because I think maybe that's what you find interesting is maybe the thing that's also your takeaway.
My takeaway is is my streaming network executive brain tells me that network streaming executives believe there's an audience of people who find these stories emotionally riveting and want to see these sort of they don't want an explanation. They just want to see the exotic, scary thing. It's kind of like watching a horror film for them. Mm-hmm. And so I think that to me, this is what this documentary is serving. I think it's serving a kind of like an audience who just wants to see. Rubbernecking is too strong a word, but who just want to hear about how awful this thing was and find that. And I think the reason. Yeah, after I didn't realize at the time, but when you said that about horror, like I think that I don't like horror films either, and so
Yeah.
I think that's why I think that doesn't resonate with me for whatever reason. And I think it is connected to other horrors other emotional stories that people have in their own lives about family members or friends they've lost to a variety of movements that strike them as unreasonable, insane, dangerous.
Right.
I think it's a piece of, in a kind of culturally and socially and politically polarized society, stories about essentially evil others are going to resonate. And this one resonates with everybody, because if you are a particular sort of person, the religious Pentecostal nature of Jones was a problem from the beginning. And so, of course, it led to this. And if you're another kind of person, well, there's all sorts of evil out there. And he was also a mark. Like, Jones is kind of perfect because you can come at him. He was both a fundamentalist and a Marxist.
That empty ideological container into which we can dump all of our anxieties. Yeah.
Exactly.
Sure.
And so there's something about this particular story that by not giving him a supervillain backstory, you can just pour whatever you want into him. And so, so that's, I think that this is a sign that there's an audience that's wants this kind of micro dwelling in the tragedy of it all documentary.
So I think that, like I don't disagree that I think that that's definitely a reason that so many cult documentaries are proliferating, for sure. In this moment, I think that the thing that made me, and this maybe is part of my takeaway too, the thing that made me feel less rubbernecky with this documentary than with others, because I do think that is so much a part of why these documentaries are so compelling, because it is interesting to like watch weird stuff and people that we don't understand. And I think that this one didn't feel like that as much, because you do hear, for example, and I think that there are a lot of moments like this, but when Jones's son, Stephen, talks about how much he hates that expression, you're just drinking the Kool-Aid, because we use that to talk about people who've just sort of zombie brained their way into swallowing whatever somebody is like serving them. And I think his like hearing him talk about why he hates that so much, because it is so dehumanizing to the people who were there, and how complicated they were, how complex, how multifaceted, how multidimensional. And we hear that from several of the followers, either by virtue of who they were and what they thought they were doing, or the friends that they made and the community that they found inside of that space. And in Guyana before Jones, met them down there, like while they were just farming and building this space. Like, I thought that was so much more complex than what we tend to get from documentaries like this. It was one of the things that I mean, the part that I found the most compelling moments in the Heaven's Gate documentary to me too were the former members and then the video of the members themselves, like talking about their own experiences. And so I appreciated that, like, that form of insight. And so I guess in that sense, like thinking about why these folks found a sense of community and belonging inside of this space also speaks to my takeaway, which is something that I've, already said in a different way. But like, if people had their social needs met, like services in the way of food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, etc. Like then the appeal of Jim Jones is a very different thing. And so in creating and focusing either obliquely or directly on Jim Jones as this megalomaniac who made it all about himself, regardless of how you approach him, I think it would be such a different conversation if we were talking about a group of people who already had stable healthcare and who weren't like giving him their social security checks in return for like free places to live, etc. Which wasn't the entire like population of the People's Temple, but it was definitely a strong cohort. And the people who weren't in that situation financially definitely had the politics that would make them want to be part of something that was organizing structurally for folks who didn't have. So instead of like, he was evil because duh, right? I don't know. Or I do know, but like there are lots of evils in the world, and even that term and like how we wield it, when, where, why, about whom is like its own conversation. But I do feel like a more attentive eye should be given to like the context that allows him as a phenomenon to exist in the first place.
What you made me think when you said that, which I think is exactly right, is each of these cults,
each of these groups called cults,
whatever.
Yes,
sure. But each of these cults, they are not. There's at least one piece that they're not wrong about, and it's also would be the thing that would prevent them from existing to begin with. So if we had the kind of socialist society that Jones is preaching, Jones wouldn't exist, right? If we had the kind of egalitarian society,
totally,
right, that Heaven's Gate was offering people, we wouldn't have Heaven's Gate, right? And so they're both like if we didn't have a kind of gig economy where dancers are dependent upon TikTok,
as
I said, I think like we wouldn't have.
This is what I'm saying.
7M, like it is that these groups have within them their own, like,
they create an ecosystem that fills a need that was pre-existing before. Yes.
But they're sort of like these they have their own undoing built in their message. And in some ways, one way to think about these cults is as like check engine lights on our society.
Right.
Like, we don't want to pay attention to that. We want to do that thing that I do when I get like the maintenance required, and I'm like, the guy at the oil place showed me how to turn that off on my minivan. So now I can like, I don't know.
Tell me what to do, van.
That's right, van. I'll change your oil when I'm damn well ready to.
Right.
But like, I think that these are
if they have their own undoing worked into them, though, then that's a critique of an economic structure and a social structure, not a critique. It's like the critique of the person. Fine. I'm not saying that that's like not part of the story or whatever. I just don't think that it is the biggest part of the story. And it also continues to perpetuate the power of the very person that we're trying to call evil. Like,
right.
He's a dude from Indiana. And the fact that he was able to rise in the ranks, doing what he was doing, becoming such a political force in his own right, and then using that toward the ends that he used it toward, like, that's...
Yeah. It's the line from The Big Lebowski. You're not wrong, Walter. You're just an asshole. Like, there's this thing of like,
Yeah. Anyway, let's talk about our cult favorites.
Yeah,
now that I'm...
Yes. What is your cult favorite?
Okay. My cult favorite is a book from my dear friend, Nora Stone. I think you know Nora too, don't you?
I do know Nora.
She's very smart and wonderful. And she wrote a book that I think would help give so much framing if you're interested in documentaries in general, cult or otherwise. Her book is called How Documentaries Went Mainstream, A History, 1960 to 2022. And she goes through like just what kind of phenomenon and what kind of media creation documentaries have become and why. And so that she moves through different paces, like, you know, moving a couple of decades at a time. And it's super interesting. It's a fascinating history. It explains a lot of my own viewing sensibilities to me, which I appreciate. And yeah, I highly recommend it.
That's a good bonus episode idea.
Mm-hmm. We should totally talk to Nora. I mean, there are so many people that I think we should talk to.
My cult favorite I found yesterday. I was so happy through the serendipity of Spotify. Grumpster is a band. They have a new self-titled album. It's not their first. They have a new self-titled album called Grumpster. I found them a couple years ago with their last album through Spotify serendipity. They are kind of a pop punk dirtbag post-punk kind of sound that I really enjoy. It's one of those bands where it's like, oh, this is what like the bands I used to listen to should sound like now. But it's a really good album. It's great for you to go into the fall, and
it's also fun to say
Grumpster. Yeah, they're great. They're a Oakland band. So yeah,
it's like grumpy plus dumpster. Is that the?
Yeah, I don't know that.
It's like Oscar the Grouch.
This is a band that like
he was a grumpster.
He was a grumpster. He was a grouch
who lived in a trash can.
Yes. Yeah, this is one of those like there's this thing now with like, because of the world of Spotify where like a band can just like show up in your
Spotify knows you better than you know yourself.
Yeah, and it can just show up and then you're like, oh.
Algorithm take the wheel.
Right. As opposed to like in the back of the like it used to be a friend who'd be like, hey, have you heard this? You should listen to this. And you're like, oh, this is really good. Like or whatever. And so I know nothing about them. I've never seen them. I don't. But the last album was really good and the second one is very good right now. And I'm very much enjoying it. And yeah. So
I'll listen to him on the way home.
All right. So what's our homework for next week?
Okay, next week, I think that because we've just waded through the murky but familiar waters of Heaven's Gate and Jonestown, and so I kind of want to I want to swing out from Center Lane a little bit and talk about Brandy Hellville and the Cult of Fast Fashion. It's on HBO. And it's not a series. So it's an hour and a half. It's a documentary. And that's what I want to talk about. It is not squarely inside the framework of like how we think about religion, but the fact that there's still like the cult of fast fashion, like I want to talk about that.
Yeah, we should definitely talk about that. No, I'm here for it.
There's lots to say. It's so interesting.
Yeah,
and there's lots to say about it.
So that's on HBO Max or Max. If y'all want to watch it by next week. Yeah. So everyone who's listening to this, please follow us on your podcast app of choice, Spotify, Apple.
You are asking people to join a community right now. Just so you know.
Yeah.
Just so you know.
All of our
communities aren't always bad.
I actually was thinking.
Community is good.
I was thinking about this. Like if you have like, oftentimes these podcast communities, they have like names for their community. That I would say that
we're not there yet, buddy.
No. Well, all of our listeners are our favorites. Aww. So they would be our favorites.
It's true.
Yeah. Yes. So please follow us on Instagram, X, TikTok at Cult Favorite Pod. Thanks again to the Department of Religious Studies, University of Alabama, for production assistance. And we will see you next Monday.